Cooler Master's images show things like a power supply mounted on the back of a radiator with the steel side of the power supply facing the radiator. It doesn't make any sense. The MasterFrame 700 is an open case. Oh man, that's actually the first time I've picked this up. Open case bench thing, and it's a little bit heavy. It can be wall mounted, by the way. Just be careful. And we're reviewing this case today as a case, as a test bench, as a wall-mounted piece of art for your gaming PC. We're going to be looking at whether this thing's actually worth it. It uses massive 3.5 mil thick steel for all of the paneling, and it's trying to fill something of a gap that the Thermaltake Core P3 targets. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs and has been used in several world record scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below. So this is a really interesting case. It is a mix of a test bench, and we happen to have a lot of experience with test benches, but it's also a case for enthusiasts who want to show off the parts, obviously, by this layout. But by trying to do too many things at once, there is a risk that it ends up good at nothing. And typically, just as a sort of disclosure of biases, when reviewing a case, the things we look for, most people watching our channel know we look for things like thermal performance and build quality especially, but thermal performance is our #1 thing to look for. One other bias, though, to disclose for this review is that typically when we see things that are trying to do too many things at once as a product, we know that there's going to be weak spots. And our general recommendation is to buy one product for one job, like a test bench for a test bench, or a case for a case. But this is trying to be both a test bench and a case. And our goal is to answer whether at $200 it's actually worthy of that. Now, $200 is actually not crazy for a test bench. Test benches are marketed and sold to professional organizations. Companies like ours will buy test benches really without thinking too hard about it, even at $200, because we know that the time it saves us and the accessibility and the ESD safety for how much we're swapping parts, all of that is easily justified in a $200 price tag because of the time savings. But as an end user, it's a bit steep. This is not off base at $200. But it's off base in a lot of other things it's doing. And it's not as simple as $200 because it doesn't come with everything either. The case is painted by Cooler Master, and this is not something they offer. So Cooler Master has, for a long time, likes to do this thing about being modder friendly, case modder friendly. This case tries to fit into that role of offering panels that are easily detachable, isolated from other components, isolated from mounting hardware, and can therefore be painted fairly easily. And the modder that Cooler Master hired for this, I think the group is IEM, did a fantastic job of modding it. But this is not what it looks like when you buy it. It's going to be a black case, it'll have some markings on it, and that's about it. It's not going to be blue, it's not going to have these embellishments, but Cooler Master's trying to say, look, you could do this if you wanted to. So in spite of being obviously a marketing stunt, this can kind of be a feature. If you're looking for something that's easy to mod, honestly, working with this, it's flat packed. It is easy to separate the parts. If you have some skill, some kind of artistry, then this would be easy to mod relative to other cases. Enough of talking through some of the basics though. Patrick spent a lot of time setting this up and evaluating it in both modes. And I came and looked at the bench mode specifically afterwards. So we're gonna walk through our thoughts in the build section. We'll go through some thermals and concluding thoughts. And as a quick note too, Cooler Master solicited ideas from reviewers when working on this case. That's not abnormal. We didn't talk to them at all about this one, but companies will often send out photos in advance and say, hey, do you think we're going in the right direction or not? And our understanding is that they did talk to quite a few reviewers about this one. We didn't talk with them about it, so this is really when we received it. It was the first time we saw it, and that made it interesting to us, but we probably would have had quite a bit of feedback if we had provided some ahead of time. We just don't normally do that unless it's at a trade show. Anyway, let's get into the build section. The case comes flat packed. Assembling it isn't time consuming, but we would have preferred a normal instruction manual to the wordless and numberless placemat that's used instead. The only major issues we encountered, other than some mind-bending perspective shift was that the two different types of thumb screws weren't consistently labeled in the instructions, and the paint and the threads of the case made it difficult to identify the correct type by sight. After experimentation, we can confirm that the black screws are used for everything except for SSD installation. The MF700 is constructed of 3.4mm thick steel plates, not aluminum. That's why it's so damn heavy. This, in a sense, might be reasonable in that it's designed as a test bench in part, so the screw holes have to be able to stand up to repeated installation cycles. But with the right hardware, aluminum would do just fine, as OpenBench Table has proven. The case includes VESA mount hardware as well for installing the case on a wall, but Cooler Master specifically warns against wall mounting systems, despite using this as a marketing point, because the total weight can't exceed 14 kilograms. That's not that heavy for this. That'll be a difficult threshold to meet, given that the MasterFrame 700's focus is on liquid cooling. Liquid cooling hardware itself is heavy. There's a lot of copper involved, and also liquid is heavy. Weight of the MF700 alone, when prepped for wall mounting without a glass panel, brackets for the panel, and the power supply cover, is 7.2 kilograms, leaving 7 kilograms for the system and presumably water, meaning that there's really not much room to actually wall mount this thing safely. Of course, you could rig your own mount and ditch this one, and that would kind of work. The assembled case is large. The tempered glass panel is 66 by 41 centimeters, and the case wings can extend further, depending on how they're adjusted. So the case is larger horizontally than a Be Quiet Darkbase Pro 900 V2, and it's not that far off in price. Wall mounting may not be the easiest option, and of course the Thermaltake Core P3 is a serious competitor that's been on the market a long time to fight this case in a wall mount. But wall mounting is one way to reduce the amount of table surface that's consumed by the MF700 and keep it from being hidden behind a monitor or just being monstrous. The MF700 can support 2 ATX power supplies. For some reason, the additional PSU slots into the space meant for 3.5-inch drives, similar to Lian Li's 011 cases. There's no dual motherboard support, but dual power supplies might come in handy if you're using this as a test bench for overclocking or something, but we've done a lot of that with dual PSUs, and I don't see myself ever using this for that purpose. And that's from a perspective of doing liquid nitrogen overclock with 2 power supplies. The wings are a mixed bag in terms of usefulness. They're at their best when the tempered glass side panel is installed, which allows fans to be mounted at the front of the case to direct air over the system, and at the rear of the case to pull hot air out, even from directly behind the GPU. This feature deserves attention. A typical case only has space for 1 fan mount above the expansion slots, but the MF700 can mount a full set of fans at both ends of the motherboard. Without the tempered glass to guide the airflow, though, it's difficult to arrange the fans so that they actually do anything without bending the wings inwards. We also found that installing high RPM fans on the wings creates a loud, resonant noise as air rushes through the diamond-shaped, pointless holes. That should be one giant gap, not a bunch of artsy holes. They prove problematic for other reasons too, like just inhibiting the airflow and the radiators that mount to the wings. Wall mounting requires removing the bar that encloses the power supply and the 3.5-inch drive mounts and moving the power supply to a side wing. This then reduces the space available for radiators, but not if you ask Cooler Master. In wall-mounted mock-ups on the product page, Cooler Master ignored this and chose to install an MWE Gold 750 power supply directly behind the single radiator with its fan facing away from the radiator. You can tell because we looked at the label, and it's really easy to see where the fan's facing if you look at the label. Cooler Master found a way to completely block off the radiator's airflow in an open-air case. That's truly an accomplishment. We don't recommend this layout, which also includes some decorative 120mm fans pointed towards a wall for bonus points. 3.5-inch drives aren't supported in this mode either unless they're attached to a side wing with some sort of adapter, by the way, not included. And so we'll move on. The I/O unit includes 1 combined audio jack, 2 USB Type-A ports, and 1 USB Type-C port. It can be installed at either the top or the bottom of the case, so it remains accessible even when the case is installed high on a wall. The built-in motherboard I/O is inconvenient to reach when the MF700 is configured as a case or a wall mount, so these front panel ports are frustratingly sparse. This isn't the best enclosure for a system that needs to connect to external devices frequently. Managing cables in a way that isn't visible is also a challenge. For instance, recreating Cooler Master's demo system would require drilling multiple holes in the wall for routing the display, the power, yikes, and the peripheral cables, and moving the power supply to a side wing that requires carefully tucking the power supply cables behind the hinges to hide them. Cable management in general is fine. It's easy to tie down cables, but it's harder to do so elegantly and invisibly with a case that goes on your wall. We also would advise against routing power cables through walls. If anything is ever starting to go wrong with the cable, if it's ever starting to melt or something weird's happening, you really want to be able to see that cable and easily smell any warning signs that might come off of it. It could become a fire hazard otherwise, so don't run that through your drywall. Cooler Master's universal vertical GPU kit is expensive on its own. The price range is $60 to $80. Since this is an open-air case, it would have been relatively easy to include an alternate PCIe bracket with a vertical mount and a riser cable. It's just stamped metal. It's not expensive to include a bracket. The Thermaltake Core P3 proves all of this, and again, is a very serious competitor that has a lot of things better, like cable management. Every single image of a system on the case's product page for the MF700 shows GPUs mounted vertically, except the single image in test bench mode. If it's being marketed with the GPU vertically in most of the images, we think the GPU vertical mount should be included, not sold as a DLC add-on. Many of you may be familiar with our rant about EATX being a fake size that isn't actually a form factor. To quote Cooler Master's website, MasterFrame 700 allows you to mount any motherboard in the consumer market, even going so far as to support 14 by 14 inch SSI EEB motherboards. The SSI EEB specification is exactly 12 by 13 inches. The most recently published EEB spec says, quote, "This represents the maximum size of the baseboard, though smaller sizes, including notched out areas, are possible." Cooler Master is fully aware of this, by the way, and we can't be too harsh on them because their case does in fact support SSI EEB boards. Instead, we'd like to take a moment to criticize ASUS one more time for causing this with their stupid, barely working 14 by 14 Dominus Extreme motherboard, which they continue to list as, quote, EEB. These boards are so niche, so expensive, and so broken, and the one overclockable processor that fits in them is so outdated that its daily users probably number in the dozens. And yet here it is, in 2021, screwing up Cooler Master's product listings. Calling the board EEB implies a specific size, but this isn't Cooler Master's problem, so let's move on. Next, time to delve into the merits of this case as a test bench, something we have a ton of experience with. We use multiple test benches of multiple types all throughout the office, every single day, more frequently than we use PC cases. These can be divided into two categories: temporary benches for quick one-off jobs, like testing whether a system or board even works before installing it in a case, and permanent benches for recurring tests, like the CPU benches, which remain unmoved for years. The MF700 is massive overkill for the one-off pre-build component bench approach. It's $200. It's huge. And sticking a motherboard on top of a cardboard box for function testing works just as well. So if you're only ever going to use a test bench setup to make sure your one build in 3 years works, then there's no point in buying this for that. We've also reviewed some cases that have removable motherboard trays that allow you to install the motherboard, test it, and slide it into the case, but that's a rarer feature today. Professional use matches the MF700 more closely, but there's a much smaller market for products like this. We're part of that market. Few consumers need to test components on an open bench frequently enough to justify the MF700. And anyone who uses a bench professionally like us should use something better, like a tech station from High Speed PC, which are more configurable, they're smaller, in some instances they're cheaper than the MF700, and they're made of non-conductive materials that are easy to modify. These are the benches that we, and by the way AMD, use for semi-permanent testing stations, and they're made mostly by one person, so that's cool too. The best compromise between these two types that we've seen is the open bench table. This design isn't as spacious as some of High Speed PC's offerings, and it's fragile in some areas, mainly the PCIe supports, because of its focus on portability. But its compactness and its portability make a more logical choice for a $200 hobbyist test bench. To that point, the open bench table weighs 1.82 kilograms, so it's a good option. The best use as a test bench we can imagine for the MF700 is maybe a wet bench, meaning a test bench compatible with liquid cooling hardware. None of the benches we've discussed thus far have exceptionally sturdy radiator support. The competitor in this space is instead the Primo Chill Praxis wet bench family. We've never used any Praxis benches, but the original model costs approximately the same as the MF700, $200. Cooler Master's disadvantage in this scenario is that the large case wings, which provide 2/3 of the case's radiator mounting locations, are restricted by the decorative metal patterns. This invalidates these mounts for use in testing radiators. The best radiator mount is at the top edge of the bench, with official support up to 420mm. Realistically, it'll support anything that can be bolted to it, but 420mm is the recommended official support. The side wings are attached with heavy hinges that can be tightened down to lock into place with friction. This works well when the case is oriented vertically, but the hinges may sag over time if the case is used as a test bench, especially if using a heavy, thick boy radiator on the wings. Further, the Allen key supplied with the case was the wrong size for the hinges, so you'll have to BYO Allen key. Cooler Master has configured the case with the wings installed and outstretched. This makes the footprint of the case extremely large in test bench mode, approximately 78 by 40 centimeters, with the wingtips touching the table. This is large enough to waste an entire table. In contrast, the giant high-speed PC HPTX top deck tech stations that we use for CPU testing are only 41 centimeters square, leaving enough space for a monitor, a mouse, and a keyboard. One final positive note for the MF700 as a test bench is that it can be transformed between case and bench without uninstalling any part of the system, including internal cables. The transformation process requires removing the glass, flipping the glass support brackets to the other side of the case, and optionally repositioning the I/O unit. That's all. Time to get into the thermals. The MasterFrame 700 is an open-air case, and it comes with no stock fans. So its thermal performance is entirely dependent on what fans are installed and whether it's sitting under an AC vent. We therefore limited our thermal tests to one round in the case mode without any fans, one in case mode with standardized sets of fans, and one in bench mode without any fans. The baseline CPU temperature in our CPU torture chart up now was an average of 57 degrees Celsius above ambient in case configuration without any fans installed. We assembled the case on a desk as usual, meaning that the bottom of the case was sealed off by the surface of the table. This is sort of technically still an open air configuration in that it has wide gaps with the sides and the top of the case. But it would be even more open when wall mounted, especially without the glass side panel. Then it's truly open air. For an idea of how beneficial that can be, configuring the system in an open bench layout without any fans caused an incredible drop in average CPU temperature that we verified and validated down to 44 degrees over ambient. Even though the case configuration is open, it still encloses the system to interfere with passive airflow and keep hot air trapped around the CPU, especially when those wings are out, the glass is on, and it's standing up on a table. It's basically a closed case at that point with a hole in the top. Restricting air paths in an open air setup is more important than ever. We're relying entirely on natural convection for cooling, so closing off a few of the sides, like the glass and the table do, has a much more drastic impact than it would in a case where there are fans pointed straight into the CPU cooler to guide the air. 57 degrees is fairly warm. It's at the same level as the Thermaltake Level 20 RS and the original Cooler Master H500P. Yikes. 44 degrees is much better, among the best results we've recorded so far, which makes sense because it's truly open air. The primary purpose of a case is to protect a computer, not to make it cooler. So case cooling is an attempt to mitigate negative effects, and sometimes with the right direction and just given the concept that the components of the system will always influence the thermal behavior, sometimes you end up with some cases that really blow it out of the water with the performance by guiding the air the right way. With that in mind, it's hard to compete thermally with just sticking a motherboard on a table in an empty room. Average GPU temperature is 52 degrees Celsius above ambient in case mode and 50 in bench mode. Again, this allows all the case components unrestricted access to cool air, and it more than makes up for the lack of fans. 52 degrees is equivalent to the LANCool 215 and the PureBase 500DX, both good cases, but 50 degrees is closer to the P400A digital. Adding our standardized set of fans for active airflow drops the average CPU temperature down to 46 degrees in case mode. Still a big improvement, but not quite as good as the just passive mode, although not distant. And that's because the passive mode is what's allowing us to remove all of those blockages. This ties it though with the Fantex P360A and the Corsair 4000D airflow with the same set of fans. Only a few cases, like the Lian Li LANCool 2 Mesh, score better than this. The GPU averaged 52 degrees in the same test. That's a less competitive average, but still tied with respectable cases like the 5000D Airflow and the MeshFi 2XL. While mounting the case or installing the GPU vertically with the tempered glass panel removed would both independently improve GPU thermals. But the fan mounts spanning the full height of the case on either side also allow experimenting with unconventional fan layouts even in case mode. So it's clear that this is a showcase system. It's meant to be used at something like a trade show if you have a company exhibiting, or in your room, I guess, gaming setup where it can be mounted to the wall and on full display. And there is a lot of allure to that idea of mounting a computer to a wall. It can look really cool. It's very unique. And if you have friends, I can't speak to this, but I would assume that they might like to look at the stuff that you have. And that would be a pretty cool way to show it off. There are other cases that do this, but there are not many of them. The Thermaltake Core P3 is one of them, and it's probably the closest competitor. The P3 is very well put together. It has dedicated cable routing channels. It's also very plain though, so perhaps that's a downside here. This is thermally inferior in some ways, can be worked with for sure, especially if you're water cooling, but there's sort of some stupid things about it that we talked about that make it difficult for use as a bench. If you're trying to do really data-centric reviews, like we can't use this as a wet bench just because of all the metal that's here blocking the actual airflow of a radiator. So we would not be able to compare radiators with this in the way. You could kind of mount it up here, but still somewhat limiting. So we wouldn't be able to use it for a bench that collects a lot of data that needs to be cleaned for publication. But if you're just swapping components, you could make the argument. It's just that most people, when you're buying something like this, it's very unlikely you're going to switch between test bench mode and mounted to the wall mode. How many times, realistically, this is not meant to be a rhetorical question. Actually ask yourself, if you're thinking of buying this, how many times are you likely to dismount this thing from the wall once it's up there? And my guess would be for most people, it's probably one, and for a couple people, it might be a few times. But very unlikely you're going to switch between test bench and this is a computer mode, because it's just not realistic. And so to that end, you end up paying 2 times as much for something that's half as good as any one dedicated thing. You can buy cheaper benches, like from High Speed PC for say $128 for their smaller ATX only sized ones that don't have all the expansiveness of the HPTX ones that we use. But you could also pay $100 for just a computer case. And in either instance, you're going to get something that has a lot more dedicated features for that task. It won't look this unique, and that's kind of where we stop. If you're looking for this, keeping in mind not blue, it'll be just black, chalkboard black. But if you're looking for this, then, well, it's $200, and you can go buy it from Cooler Master. But we do think that there are a lot of other things that would make more sense to buy first. This really does seem like a case of trying to find any marketable reason to sell this thing, when in reality, it probably should have been more focused on doing one thing, like competing with the Core P3 if that's what they wanted to compete with. But instead, they're trying to compete with Open Bench Table, High Speed PC, anyone else, Praxis, for example, and also Thermaltake, and also normal cases. And it's just too much for something to compete with. And so we can't justify this one. This is not even in our top 3 for test benches, and I can only think of 4 that I would buy. So it doesn't make my list for a test bench as a professional, that is, using them every day. It doesn't make my list for a wall-mounted PC because we're a little sketched out by it, since the kit itself advises a limitation of something like 14 kilograms, and you're already halfway there with just the case, and then you're going to add water. And it also has weird mounting locations for the power supplies that obstruct the radiators. Cooler Master's own images. This was absolutely insane, what Cooler Master showed on their website. Cooler Master's images show things like a power supply mounted on the back of a radiator with the steel side of the power supply facing the radiator. It doesn't make any sense. And then they also have, that's right, it's also wireless. You can see that they've clearly photoshopped it onto the wall. It wasn't actually mounted there for photography. So, you know, there's a lot of shortcomings. Very interesting, looks kind of neat, but not something we would choose. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to get bonus videos a couple times a month, and we'll see you all next time.